This led them to seek to identify programs that would enable them both to manage capitalism in such a way that they could at the same time appear to be producing gains for workers. People who looked at the history of social democracy and social democratic parties, there's this kind of point from 1945 where they discover Keynesian demand management as the key element that allows them to get over this problem of how do you at the same time manage capitalism and benefit working class constituency that you're trying most to appeal to. Keynesianism allowed social democratic parties to have a program for managing capitalism, which is basically spend when you have a recession, and to target that spending on the working class, so that you have a program which enables you to do both things at once, and obviously became a major pillar of social democratic policy. There is, though, a second side to this story, and that is the side that recognises that in seeking to steer disaffected workers' demands through parliamentary channels, and in seeking to make these demands compatible with the management of capitalism, the party elites of social democratic parties sought to perpetuate the dependence of those disaffected workers upon both representative party elites and upon the functioning of capitalism. The Social Democratic Party strategy is therefore one that seeks to both meet workers' demands for better living and working conditions, and at the same time ensure that those demands don't get out of hand. The aim for Social Democratic Party leaders is to ensure that workers temper their demands so that they can remain compatible with the parliamentary process, and so that capitalism can continue to be manageable by the labour movement's parliamentary elite. Social democratic parties, therefore, are constituted by a party elite that seeks to encourage working class demands, seeks to meet those demands, but at the same time seeks to ensure that those demands are sufficiently limited so that they pose no threat to capitalism and no threat to parliamentary democracy. How are we doing for time? Okay. So the second set of relationships, that's the first set, the party elite, party mass that I would talk about. The second set of relationships that I would talk about are those of capitalism itself. And here the important point for me is to have a clear understanding of the way that capitalism operates. And I'll try to be brief here, I'm talking to the Commune, so presumably we have some analysis of capitalism already. But as we know, capitalism constantly struggles but fails to deal with its internal contradictions. Competition between capitalists sees them constantly strive for efficiency savings, restructuring, and the constant drive for greater productivity and more intensive methods of production. This is the process whereby capitalists compete for a greater share of profit, but at the same time, by competing for greater shares of profit, they also make it more difficult for profit itself to be created. Efficiency savings mean job losses, which means less demand in the economy. Productivity improvements mean the value of goods produced falls, undermining the value of existing stock. Capitalists are therefore constantly faced with the problem of making a profit within an environment within which opportunities for further productivity measures are difficult to find, and when they're found, they undermine macroeconomic demand. Capitalism, therefore, which depends upon the production of profit, at the same time faces a constant struggle to produce and realise that profit, and in seeking to do so, undermines the stable conditions necessary for exploitation to be profitable. What we see basically then, as we know, is that capitalism goes into a constant series of crises. Every time it tries to resolve those crises, that means an attempt to make exploitation more intense. So and every time there is a partial resolution of those crises, it sets it up on a bigger scale and a grander scale, so that the next crisis is even more damaging. In sum, the relationships that make up social democratic parties are ones whereby a party elite seeks to meet and limit the demands of the workers that form its electoral core. And further, in times of capitalist crisis, social democratic parties must seek to convince, social democratic party elites must seek to convince those workers that they should accept an increase in the extent and intensity of exploitation. And on top of this, that they should accept this further increase in exploitation as being somehow reasonable and in workers' own interests. Social democratic parties, therefore, and this obviously includes the Labour Party, are constantly faced with the task of convincing the workers who form their constituency that they should accept the latest round of welfare cuts, pay cuts, job cuts, or workload increases in order that capitalism can continue to be manageable, and in order that they can continue to accept that somehow the workers who vote for social democratic parties are somehow having their interests represented by those social democratic party elites. So it is in this light that we should view the Labour Party, New Labour, Old Labour, and any potential new Workers' Party, in that they are all ultimately required to advocate the worsening of workers' conditions and to seek to sell that worsening back to the workers who form their core constituency as somehow in their best interests. This is in order that the Labour Party can continue to both manage capitalism and seek to meet the ever more limited, well they hope they're ever more limited, demands of the workers they depend on for their electoral survival. Okay, so this is basically how I'd argue we should view social democratic parties, the Labour Party included. And then obviously thinking about Old Labour to New Labour, I thought I'd sort of highlight some examples, basically sort of giving some kind of evidence to show how this process has always been around. Obviously there's a difference between New Labour and Old Labour, I'm not denying that, but what I would deny is that the problem of the betrayal of by the party elite has always been a problem. So we know the example of 1931, Ramsay MacDonald, when he chose sterling over the unemployment benefits for his own working class constituency. Some other examples, and this is particularly taken from Leo Panich's Social Democracy and Industrial Militancy, which is a very good book, but even if it is 30 years old now, which he talks about in 1948, the Attlee government's white paper, where they were trying to achieve convertibility of sterling, and they put out a white paper, the statement on personal incomes, costs and prices, advocating wage freezes, and then again in the name of the interests of the economy, which they argued would then benefit their voters. And again, this was and this time that was accepted by the trade union leaders at the time. If we move to the 1950s, the Labour Party, especially after the 1955 general election, started arguing for a moderation of party policy. So Crossland, famous author of The Future of Socialism, argues that so long as we maintain a substantial private sector, socialists must logically applaud the accumulation of private profit. And also in 1957, the Labour Party adopted the document Industry and Society, in which again they argued that capitalism is in the interests of the working class constituency they stood upon, arguing under increasingly professional management, large firms are as a whole serving the nation well, and no organisation, public or private, can operate effectively if it is subjected to persistent and detailed intervention from above. In other words, we should let the capitalists get on with it. Moving to the 1960s, the 1966 Wilson government re-elected, obviously elected 64 and then re-elected in 66, immediately entered into a fierce industrial dispute with the National Union of Seamen, arguing for low wages. At the same time, introduced a deflationary package to reduce government spending, increased indirect taxation, which obviously hits those at the bottom end higher than the top end, introduced a 6-month wage freeze, abandoned the commitment to full employment, and all of this was presented in the interests of the workers in the following terms. This is Wilson. The prices and incomes policy is not a whim of a government department, not a bright idea that has occurred to Secretary of State for Economic Affairs George Brown and me. It is a necessary condition of maintaining full employment, i.e. it's going to benefit you, the workers. And if we go now to just on the eve of the winter of discontent, when the Callaghan government's trying to impose its 5% pay limit, which would ultimately lead to the winter of discontent. In arguing for this is Transport Minister William Rogers, again arguing this is going to benefit us somehow. In the national interest, and not least in the interest of maintaining and improving public services, it must be understood that if public sector wages take a bigger share of the national cake, then if we are not simply to finance inflation by printing money, as our predecessors did, the consequences are clear. Moving now to Blair, again obviously trying to sell the thing, this time not necessarily trying to argue that we can't afford welfare services, but actually we don't even want welfare services. So Blair, in a global economy, the old ways won't do. Of course a fair tax system is right, but really a life on benefit dependent on the state is not what most people want. They want independence, dignity, self-improvement, a chance to earn and get on.